Hello everyone, our lesson for today is all about different international trade theories. Around 5,200 years ago, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia was probably the first city the world had ever seen, housing more than 50,000 people within its 6 miles of wall. Uruk, its agriculture made by prosperous and sophisticated irrigation canals, was home to the first class of middlemen, trade intermediaries, a cooperative trade network, and set the pattern that would endure for the next 6,000 years, according to Matt Ridley of the Wall Street Journal. To better understand how modern global trade has evolved, it's important to understand how countries traded with one another historically. Over time, economists have developed theories to explain the mechanisms of global trade, and the main historical theories are called classical and are from the perspective of a country or country based. And these are the first is mercantilism, then absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and heckscher-ohlintheory theory or the factor proportions theory. By the mid 20th century, the theories began to shift to explain trade from a firm rather than a country perspective. These theories are referred to as modern and are firm based or company based. Both of these categories, classical and modern, consist of several international theories. And the modern firm based theory are country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. Now let's discuss the classical country-based theory first. Developed in the 16th century, mercantilism was one of the earliest efforts to develop an economic theory, and this theory stated that a country's wealth was determined by the amount of its gold and silver holdings. In its simplest sense, mercantilists believe that a country should increase its holdings of gold and silver by promoting exports and discouraging imports. In other words, if people in other countries buy more from you, or it is called as export, than they sell to you or imports, then they have to pay you the difference in gold and silver. The objective of each country was to have a trade surplus or a situation where the value of exports are greater than the value of imports, and to avoid a trade deficit or situation where the value of imports is greater than the value of exports. A closer look at world history from the 1500s to the late 1800s helps explain why mercantilism flourished. The 1500s marked the rise of new nation states, whose rulers wanted to strengthen their nations by building larger armies and national institutions. By increasing exports and trade, these rulers were able to amass more gold and wealth for their countries. One way that many of these new nations promoted exports was to impose restrictions on imports, and this strategy is called protectionism and is still used until today. In 1776, Adam Smith questioned the leading mercantile theory of the time in The Wealth of Nations. This is the title of the book that he wrote. Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And then recent versions have been edited by scholars and economists. Smith offered a new trade theory called absolute advantage, which focused on the ability of a country to produce a good more efficiently than another nation. Smith reasoned that trade between countries shouldn't be regulated or restricted by government policy or intervention. He stated that trade should flow naturally according to market forces. In a hypothetical two-country world, if country A produced a good cheaper or faster or both than country B, then, then country A had the advantage and could focus on specializing on producing that good. Similarly, if country B was better at producing another goods or good, it could focus on specialization as well. By specialization, countries would generate efficiencies because their labor force would become more skilled by doing the same task. Production would also become more efficient because there would be an incentive to create faster and better production methods to increase the specializations. So, like in this example, so if China or our country A and our country B, which is Japan, so if the labor force are more skilled by doing the same task because do it or they do it every day, so they are more efficient and they can work faster to produce more cars to sell in the market. Now, the challenge to the absolute advantage theory was that some countries may be better at producing both goods and therefore have an advantage in many areas. In contrast, another country may not have a useful absolute advantage. To answer this challenge, David Ricardo, an English economist, introduced the theory of comparative advantage in 1817. Ricardo reasoned that even if country A had the absolute advantage in the production of both products, specialization and trade could still occur between two countries. Comparative advantage occur when a country cannot produce a product more efficiently than the other country. However, it can produce that product better and more efficiently than it does other goods. The difference between these two theories is subtle. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productivity differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at absolute productivity. Now let's look at a simplified hypothetical example to illustrate the subtle difference between these principles. In this example, Hannah is an accountant who charges 1,000 pesos per hour for her accounting services. It turns out that Hannah can also type faster than the administrative assistant in her office, who is paid 400 pesos per hour. So even though Hannah clearly has the absolute advantage in both skill sets, should she do both jobs? Of course, no. For every hour Hannah decides, it is because for every hour Hannah decides to type instead of do an accounting work, she would be giving up 600 pesos in income. Her productivity and income will be highest if she specializes in the higher paid accounting services and hires the most qualified administrative assistant who can type fast and although a little slower than Hannah. By having both Hannah and her assistant concentrate on their respective tasks, their overall productivity as a team is higher, and this is what's called as comparative advantage. So a person or a country will specialize in doing what they do relatively better. In reality, the world economy is more complex and consists of more than two countries and products. And barriers to trade, and barriers to trade happen. The next one is the theories of Smith and Ricardo's didn't help countries determine which products would give a country an advantage. Both theories assume that free and open markets would lead countries and producers to determine which goods they could produce, or they could produce more efficiently. In the early 1900s, two Swedish economists, Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin, focused their attention on how a country could gain comparative advantage by producing products that utilize factors that were in abundance in the country. Their theory is based on a country's production factors, the land, labor, and capital, which provide the funds for investment in plants and equipment. They determined that the cost of any factor or resource was a function of supply and demand. Factors that were in great supply relative to demand would be cheaper. Factors in great demand relative to supply would be more expensive, and their theory, also called the factor proportions theory, stated that countries would produce and export goods that required resources or factors that were in great supply and therefore cheaper production factors. In contrast, countries would import goods that require resources that were in short supply but higher demand. For example, China and India are home to cheap large pools of labor. Hence, these countries have become the optimal location for labor-intensive industries like textiles and garments. In the early 1950s, Russian-born American economist Vasily W. Leontief studied the U.S. economy closely and noted that the United States was abundant in capital and therefore should export more capital-extensive goods. However, his research using capital data showed the opposite. The United States was importing more capital intensive goods according to the factor proportions theory. The United States should have been importing labor intensive goods, but instead it was actually exporting them. His analysis became known as Daliantive Paradox because it was the reverse of what was expected by the factor proportions theory. In subsequent years, economists have noted historically at that point in time, labor in the United States was both available in steady supply and more productive than in many other countries. Hence, it made sense to export labor-intensive goods. Over the decades, many economists have used theories and data to explain and minimize the impact of the paradox. So, what is paradox? Paradox meaning a statement that seems contradictory, unbelievable, but that may be true in fact. However, what remains clear is that international trade is complex and impacted by numerous and often changing factors. Trade cannot be explained neatly by one single theory, and more importantly, our understanding of international trade theories continues to evolve. So, to summarize our discussion for today, we discuss about the classical country-based theory, which are mercantilism, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and heckscher-ohlintheory or factor proportions theory.